All right, my friends. Well, I make it exactly 11 o'clock here. I don't know what time it is around the world for you all, but I want to begin today's session by saying thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's really kind of special to see so many people who are interested in this issue. I think it speaks to how serious today's issue is and also how much kind of uncertainty there is. You know, there's so many sources we can get media from today, but sometimes that makes things even more complicated and more confusing than having one source. And I think the fact that so many people have joined both this morning's event and we had a similar event last night with nearly 400 people really speaks to, I think, both of those things. So I'm really glad you can all join us today, and I hope that we can answer some of your questions and maybe make things a bit more clear for you throughout the course of today's webinar. Today's two main speakers are Yahav and Mohammad, and before I introduce them, I just want to have a couple of minutes to introduce myself and the work of the Green Olive Collective, because it's great to see we have several dozen new people who maybe don't know the work of Green Olive joining us for the first time today. So my name is Alex, obviously, and I am the Vice President of the Green Olive Collective. Green Olive is an international organization which has been around for nearly 14 years now. We have over 400 members spread all around the world. Membership, by the way, is open to everybody, so if you'd like to become a member, you're welcome to do that. We also have several of our members here today, so welcome to you. And then here on the ground in Israel-Palestine, we have 11 working partners, 5 Israelis, 5 Palestinians, and 1 international, which is myself. We also have dozens of other guides and drivers and support staff, administrators, and all of us agree that the current political situation in Israel-Palestine is unacceptable. We believe that the occupation should end, and we believe in promoting a more just vision of the future based around respect for human rights and democratic values for all who live here. We have many different ways to promote this vision. We offer tours, educational online sessions, documentaries we produce. We also have an online fair trade website, madeinpeace.com, and many, many other activities. And obviously, since the impact of the coronavirus has meant most people cannot come to visit us here on the ground, our physical tours, for the most part, for the last year have stopped. And we've really tried to embrace this new medium of online tours and webinars to reach a bigger audience. We really believe that the international community has an important part to play in the issues here through different, advocacy and that kind of thing. And we believe that education is one of the first and most important things. So being informed is really important from a wide variety of different sources, which we believe we have within our collective. So today's session will begin with a very short kind of timeline. I'm just going to lay out what's been happening in Israel-Palestine over the last month. Then Yahav is going to give us a bit more history and a small tour of one of the neighborhoods at the heart of all of this, Sheik Jarrah. And then we'll be joined by Mohammad, who will explain a bit more about the importance of Al-Aqsa Mosque to the Palestinian people. And then we're going to open it up to questions. Because of the size of the group today, I can't promise we're going to be able to answer everybody's question. We're going to do our best. And if you do have questions at any point during the session, please just type them to me in the chat. And then about halfway through today's 90-minute session, I can call on people who'd like to maybe ask their questions aloud, and we'll try and dig a bit deeper into some of the issues which really interest you. Today's session doesn't have a set fee. There's no cost to be here today, but of course there is a cost involved for us to produce these events, and almost all of our guides and other staff have been without work for the past year. So at the end of today's session, if you would like to contribute something towards the costs that are involved in producing these events and support our collective, that's of course very much appreciated. And what I'll do is I'll paste a link in the chat here. It's very easy to remember, greenolivetours.com/contributions. And at the end, you can leave whatever you felt today's session was worth. I should say that as well as supporting our collective, we also do donate some of the proceeds of all of our online events and tours to a very, very worthy charity, the PCRF, Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which does some amazing work, specifically in the area of health, mostly in Gaza, providing healthcare to kids who just wouldn't get it any other way. So 2 very worthy causes. If you'd like to support us at the end, that would be great. So I think that's all I need to say in terms of admin stuff. Maybe before I start with a kind of timeline, I could just get Yahav first and then Mohammad just to introduce themselves and say hello, and then we can begin. So Yahav, if you'd like to say hi, the floor is yours.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Good to see you here. My name is Yahav. I'm a tour guide with Green Olive Tours. I'm an Israeli Jew from Jerusalem. Yeah, I'm very interested in history, in the history of this country and the history of this conflict, in the way history is told and sometimes misrepresented. I'll tell you more about that soon.
Thank you, Yahav. Mohammad, would you like to say hello? We can't hear you, Mohammad. Sorry, just need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mohammad Barakat. I'm a Palestinian. I was born after the war of 1948 in the old city of Jerusalem for a family which they fled out from their homeland, which is a small village more to the west of Jerusalem. It's about 4 or 5 miles from the center of Jerusalem. My family, they came and settled in the old city of Jerusalem for a while. Then we had the chance to stay and to live in Sheik Jarrah neighborhood at the end of the 50s up till 75. So I'm familiar with the neighborhood of Sheik Jarrah. All those families who are living over there are my friends, because those are the second generation of the refugees, because their parents were the first generation. So they are in my age. We were, friends in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I'm the second generation, as I told you. I was an eyewitness over the war of 1967, because that's the neighborhood that I lived in. It was on the borderline, so I remember everything what happened. I got married in 1975. I have 5 children, which those are the third generation of the refugees. Beside them, I have 12 grandchildren, which those are the fourth generation of the refugees. So this is a story which could tell you that millions of Palestinians it's the same story of most of the Palestinians, which they are scattered all over the world and in Palestine. Thank you for joining again, and we will have more things to talk about.
Thank you, Mohammad, and thank you, Yahav. So yeah, you'll be hearing more from both of our speakers in just a moment. But I think to begin, as I said, I'd like to show you guys all a very brief timeline of events, just so we're familiar with what's been going on in the last month or so. I know that it can be very confusing, even just to try and keep up with the news. So hopefully this just kind of lays things out in a kind of clear way. And I'm also very much aware that choosing these events and deciding where to start is also making an important, political statement, but we have to begin somewhere. So I think the most logical place to begin is October last year. That was when the Israeli court released a ruling calling for the eviction of 4 families, about 70 people in total, in the neighborhood of Sheik Jarrah. Both Mohammad and Yahav will speak more about this neighborhood in a few moments. And then we come to more kind of current events. The 12th of April was when Ramadan, the Muslim holy month, began, and the Israeli police set up barricades around the Damascus Gate, one of the entrances to the old city. They said to control the crowds, which often spend time in the evening sitting there on the steps. And this caused a lot of concern among Palestinian Muslims, especially, and protests. The very next day, the Israeli army cut the electricity to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the most important mosque, which Mohammad will explain a bit more about in just a few moments, and stopped the call to prayer being broadcast. And any kind of changes to the status quo around Al-Aqsa are seen as very provocative. And so already tensions were fairly high. Then on the 15th of April, we had the first of the so-called TikTok attacks, which showed a young Palestinian guy slapping 2 Orthodox Jews, religious Jews, in the face on the light rail in Jerusalem. And since then, we've seen a kind of spate of these short videos being uploaded to social media, mostly young men doing similar kind of low-level aggressions, some Muslims, some Jews, some Palestinians, some Israelis, kind of in these tit-for-tats social media postings. On the 22nd, there was a big march by a Israeli right-wing group, which resulted in more fights and brawls. And then we had on the 23rd, the very next day, the first exchange of fire between the IDF and Gaza. And I should say that although this was the first time in this round of fighting that we had exchange of fire, it's fairly common that there are rockets and missiles fired back and forth between Gaza and Israel. This is not something which is absolutely new. Over the past 15 years that Israel's been blockading Gaza, this does flare up fairly regularly, but obviously what's happening now is at a scale that's only been seen a couple of times before. Then on the 25th, the police made the decision to remove these barricades, which kind of in a way started it all. And it seemed for several days that maybe things were going to calm down. Then on the 2nd, there was a terrorist attack in the West Bank in which one Israeli was shot and killed, 2 others were injured. They were religious students in a fairly extreme settlement called Itamar, but nevertheless a very tragic event. And then 2 days later, an important event in Israeli politics. We've had 4 elections in the past 2 years in Israel, and never has a coalition been able to form with a governing majority. The biggest party in most of these elections has been the Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And after the election that we had recently, he was given 30 days to form a coalition. He was unable to, and it expired on May the 4th, giving his next biggest rival, kind of from a centre-left party, the chance to try and form a coalition as well. Possibly an important event in this timeline. Then on the 6th, we had another right-wing group setting up a table in Sheik Jarrah, right next to a table which was being used by Palestinian protesters in solidarity with these families at risk of eviction. They were celebrating the iftar, which is the traditional meal which breaks the fast every day at the end of Ramadan, and there were more clashes that night. Then on the 7th of May, which was a Friday, we had a lot of restrictions preventing Palestinians from praying the traditional Friday Ramadan prayers in Al-Aqsa. Often there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who come to Jerusalem for prayers on this day, and the restrictions meant that a much, much smaller number could come. This again caused a lot of concern, caused a lot of demonstrations, some of which turned violent. The following day was Laylatul Qadr, one of the most important nights of Ramadan. Mohammad maybe will talk a bit more about this, and there were clashes in and around the mosque area. The following morning, things really kicked off, and the IDF stormed this big compound around the mosque, injuring hundreds of Palestinians. And the very same day, the Israeli Attorney General decided to pause the final decision on the evictions of the families in Sheik Jarrah by a month, right on the same day. By coincidence, the very next day was also quite a flashpoint day, often is throughout the years, Jerusalem Day. Yahav will explain the history of Jerusalem Day for us in a moment. I'll say just this, for particularly right-wing national religious Israelis, this is a day of great celebration when they celebrate what they consider to be the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967. They often have fairly provocative marches through Muslim areas of the old city, and in the current tensions, the decision was made at the last minute to reroute the parade away from some of the real hot points, but it nevertheless went ahead. And later on that day, we had a kind of domino effect of different events. There was a big riot in the Israeli city of Lod. Now, something which I think is often quite surprising to visitors who come from the outside to Israel-Palestine is that most of the towns and cities here are really quite segregated. You know, a village may be Jewish or Arab, and very rarely do they mix. Lod is one of the few exceptions where there is a mixed population. And this was kind of the first time, I guess, that we saw violence in these mixed towns. And it's set off a very worrying chain of event where we've seen kind of similar stories of riots and attacks in these mixed areas all throughout Israel. One person died that day, and actually just yesterday, another Israeli died as a result of injuries from this riot. May the 10th was a very busy day. That was also the day when an announcement was widely expected that this kind of centre and centre-left wing coalition was going to announce they managed to form a government. They postponed that announcement, and it seems that that's unlikely to be made anytime soon. Israel also that same day closed off the 2 access points between Israel and Gaza. Gaza is already very, very, very difficult to access in or out, but those 2 crossings were completely closed and have remained closed since the 10th. And also on that day, Hamas released an ultimatum saying that unless the Israeli troops fully withdrew from the Al-Aqsa Mosque area and called off the evictions in Sheik Jarrah, they would launch rockets towards Jerusalem. At 6 o'clock, that deadline passed, and a few minutes later, 150 rockets were launched towards Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, called this crossing a line and began widespread attacks and kind of retaliation in Gaza. So this is kind of the first time that Gaza was kind of pulled into the recent events. The following day, the mayor of Lod asks the government to declare a state of emergency. The Israeli government does so, and also the same day they destroyed a 13-story tower in Gaza City, the Hanadi Tower. Since then, many more have followed. And then a day later, the violence spreads to the West Bank for the first time. 2 Palestinians are killed in separate incidents. And since then, we've had sort of spiraling violence really all over the region. And we have had more deaths in really in all areas. This is a graphic from Al Jazeera, which kind of quite succinctly explains where we've seen the most violence and the most deaths. And I'm afraid to say that this is only a day or 2 old, and this already needs to be updated. So on the next slide here, we can see nearly 3,000 rockets have been fired towards Israel from Gaza in the past week and a half, causing 10 deaths. I think it is important to say a couple of things. About 90% of the rockets which the Iron Dome tries to intercept, it does manage to explode in the air before they land. And that's what you see in this picture. Rockets being fired from Gaza on the right-hand side of the picture, being intercepted by this amazing piece of Israeli military technology on the left-hand side of the picture. And about 1 in 5 of the projectiles fired from Gaza don't even make it outside the Gaza fence and actually land inside Gaza. So the people, the civilians of Gaza end up suffering twice over. We don't have the same kind of level of data of how many projectiles have been fired into Gaza. We do know the updated death toll, unfortunately. Over 200 now have been killed in Gaza, including many children. Clashes in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and even spreading to neighboring countries. 2 Lebanese have been killed by Israeli army forces near the border. There have been protests on the border of Jordan, which is very worrying for the kind of wider regional security. This picture, by the way, shows that Hanadi Tower, the first big tower block, which was destroyed in Gaza. So I hope that very quick run through was useful, just to get all the dates in order. And now I'm going to pass you over to Yahav, who's going to provide us with a bit more detail about what's happening specifically in Sheik Jarrah, which, as we said, is the neighborhood where kind of all of this really, you could argue, began. So Yahav, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I am going to talk about Sheik Jarrah, but as I suggested earlier, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go back and tell some larger history to put Sheik Jarrah in context. And well, okay, let's start with some history and then see what I can do. So every week I give an introduction to Israel-Palestine online, and I always start with this slide, which what you see here, I Googled a map of Israel and I Googled map of Palestine and I put them next to each other. Just so you see this thing, which is often very confusing for everybody in this country and around the world, that Israel and Palestine, quite remarkably, are words that describe the same place, right? So they're not 2 separate regions. Sometimes we get people saying, I've been to Israel, but I haven't been to Palestine. I've been to Palestine, but I haven't been to Israel. I'd like to go to Palestine also. No, Israel and Palestine are 2 names for the same place. This shape which we have, as you can see here, in pendants that Israelis and Palestinians wear in graffitis and in tattoos, is actually something that the British invented. The British drew these lines, and they helped bring Jews from Europe here, and they helped basically set up our modern conflict. And as the British were leaving in 1947, the United Nations suggested what you see in the center of this slide, a very complicated sharing of the country. So the orange would be the Arab state and the blue would be the Jewish state. Jerusalem would be international because it was 50-50. It couldn't be properly divided. Jaffa was supposed to be an island inside the Arab state. That never happened. What actually happened is we had a war when the British left, or at least some people contested that yesterday. Let's say we had widespread violence when the British left. And in those events, the Zionist movement, what became the state of Israel, conquered the vast majority of what was British Palestine. What's on the right side here, everything that was proposed to be the Jewish state and about half of what was proposed to be the Arab state. And as they did so, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, became refugees. Mohammad already said that he is a second-generation refugee. Most Palestinians became refugees in the 1948 war, just about 60% of the Palestinian population. And a great number of those refugees were settled within this country, in what became the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and in what became the Jordanian-controlled West Bank and East Jerusalem. And a small number remained within what became the state of Israel. Maybe I'll show you. It's actually part of another presentation, I think. Where is it? Here. Can you see this now? Where are Palestinians today? You see, some of them are in Gaza, some of them are in the West Bank, some of them are refugees in other countries, and almost 2 million of them are what is called here Palestinian citizens of Israel. So these people are the descendants of those people, just as Mohammad is a descendant of those people who were forced to flee what became the state of Israel in 1948. The Palestinian citizens of Israel are descendants of those people who managed by various circumstances to remain within what became the state of Israel in 1948, and those people got Israeli citizenship. Now, you see here this chart called the Palestinian citizens of Israel. The Israeli government doesn't like that term. The Israeli government talks about Israeli Arabs, right? So they want to disconnect them from the rest of Palestinians. But all these people who are Palestinian citizens of Israel have relatives in Gaza and in the West Bank and in other Arab countries. Families were split in the 1948 war. People fled different ways. And a lot of these people, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, are internally displaced, right? So they're inside Israel, but they're not in the villages and towns that were originally where their families were from, because in the war they moved, but they somehow remained within what became the borders of the state of Israel. And so they are living in homes. What the Israeli government did after the war, first of all, they sealed the borders. They said absolutely nobody may come back, and anybody trying to come back will be shot. But some people did sneak back. They sealed the borders, and at the same time, they confiscated all the property of those Palestinians who had left. And so many of the so-called Israeli Arabs, or the Palestinian citizens of Israel, particularly in the cities, in Haifa, in Lid, in Jaffa, in Aqsa, are living in homes that before 48 belonged to other Palestinian families. And those homes have been confiscated by the state of Israel. And so they are renting from the state of Israel as protected tenants what used to be the homes of other Palestinians, which means they are constantly threatened with possible eviction if the state of Israel wants those homes for any reason. Now, I've maybe gone into a little bit too much detail, but my point in all this is to tell you, Palestinians have in their, almost always in their own personal family memory, the memory of being forcefully displaced, of being removed from their homes and not being able to return. And this is an underlying, so the events of 1948 are called in Arabic the Nakba, the catastrophe. And although those events are the events of 1948, many Palestinians will tell you the Nakba is actually ongoing. It was a big event in 1948 where most Palestinians were displaced, but also those who remain are threatened, and the state of Israel continues in different ways to push them out. So here is Jerusalem. See, what's marked in yellow is the old city. And the double green line that's running through the city is the green line, which was the border at the end of the 1948 war. And I told you in the 1948 war, Palestinians were forced out of most of the country, including West Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Palestinians became refugees from West Jerusalem. At the same time, several thousand Jews were forced out of East Jerusalem by the Jordanian army. So in general, we have to say this. In the 1948 war, we had forced displacement of population on both sides. It just wasn't anywhere near the same numbers. So hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced out of what became Israel, and several thousand Jews were forced out of what became the Jordanian West Bank. And one of the places where Jews were displaced is Sheik Jarrah, is a neighborhood just north of the old city of Jerusalem. And so there was empty land. And that's one of the places where the Jordanian government and the United Nations suggested resettling Palestinian refugees, right? Like Mohammed's family, we said other people who were displaced from West Jerusalem, from Jaffa, from Haifa. Not only could they live there, but the UN said, you know what, we have Palestinian refugees are eligible for healthcare and education and things from the UN. But here in Sheikh Jarrah, we're going to offer people houses. And by accepting these houses, people will give up their UN refugee status. This was a very controversial idea for many Palestinians. They said, but I want to return to Haifa, to Jaffa, to West Jerusalem, to where I'm from. This is not really my home. But some people made that choice and they said, that'll come later. Right now, I want a home for my family. And people took this deal and moved into these houses and expanded these houses and planted gardens around them. And we got 28 families in Sheikh Jarrah who, in a sense, did what Israel would like them to do. Right? They gave up, officially at least, on their refugee status. In some sense, maybe they gave up on their demand to return to West Jerusalem, to Haifa, to Jaffa. They resettled within East Jerusalem, within what was the Jordanian area. But then we had another war in 1967. Israel conquered also the West Bank, also East Jerusalem, separated East Jerusalem, that's here in the middle, from all of the West Bank. They said it's not Israel, we're temporarily holding it under Israeli military government. But East Jerusalem, they said, this is now annexed to Israel. And within, this is the old city again, is this little square here. Within East Jerusalem, they started building big new Jewish neighborhoods around the Palestinian neighborhoods. That's the neighborhoods here in blue, and the Palestinian neighborhoods are in yellow. And Sheikh Jarrah here north of the old city is yellow, is a Palestinian neighborhood. And the idea was we'll build enough Jewish neighborhoods around the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem to make impossible a Palestinian capital, the capital of a future Palestinian state in East Jerusalem. But in the 1990s, when it became apparent that it was still possible to create a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, they started looking for ways to settle Jews into the old city, into Sheikh Jarrah, into Silwan, into the central area of East Jerusalem. And the main way they found, this is a map of little Jewish settlements inside Palestinian neighborhoods. The main way they found is by finding these places where Jews lived before. And they said they came to these families living in Sheikh Jarrah over here, and they told them, look, you are squatting illegally on land that belongs to Jews, because Jews lived here before 1948. They were displaced forcefully, and now you just squatted on their land, or the UN and the Jordanian government put you on their land in the 1950s, but it's still their land, and we are their Jewish organization came along and said, we now are the heirs to that land, and we want to evict these families and build here a new Jewish neighborhood. The thing about this is it's absolutely legal in the Israeli law, right? So Israel created a system of law which says what Palestinians owned, like the people who are living now in Sheikh Jarrah, what their families owned in West Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Jaffa, has been confiscated by the Israeli state because they left in the 1948 war. But it doesn't work the other way. The Jews who left in the 1948 war, who left Sheikh Jarrah at that same time, their property is still theirs. And so we are moving to evict people, to make them refugees for the second time, because when they were made refugees, they were displaced into a place where Jews lived before. This is an aerial photograph of the area we're talking about in Sheikh Jarrah. And this is pretty up to date. The blue is houses where Palestinians were already evicted and Jewish families moved in with armed guards to establish a presence. And the red is houses which are currently in court cases where they're moving to evict them. And when they started these evictions about 10 years ago, we got huge protests of Palestinians and Israelis saying this is not right. Israelis on the left saying this is not right, to make Palestinians refugees for the second time. And what happened was this big wave of protests after several families were evicted stopped the evictions. Although legally, there's no, in the Israeli legal system, these families should be evicted. The Israeli government didn't like this attention, didn't like this media, didn't like this image of this focus on Palestinians being made refugees for the second time. And the eviction stopped for 10 years. And in the past few weeks, they've been pushing forward with evictions again. This is from a few years ago. I just thought this was a cute picture. The guy behind the megaphone is Jimmy Carter. Just to show you this issue, Sheikh Jarrah got a lot of international attention before, and people from around the world have been here and have been protesting this. This is he your age, Mohammad, Nabil? See. Oh, you're on silent. This is one of the heads of the families, let's say, who's threatened with eviction right now. This is his neighbors, all these families who have been here for 60 years now, generations born in these houses, resettled as refugees. Now they're being threatened with displacement. This is just from 2 weeks ago. They made a big iftar meal as a sort of protest, and many Palestinians came, and the police just crashed into them with huge force. A lot of things in this story seem to me like, and maybe we'll answer questions about this later, seem to me like the Israeli government and police were pushing towards a confrontation, and they chose Sheikh Jarrah as an issue that would, Sheikh Jarrah and Aqsa, which Mohammad will talk about, but as issues which would press Palestinian buttons. And Sheikh Jarrah is a very clear one because of the displacement, because of the threat of people being left homeless again. This is a protest in Jaffa. And the sign that's being held up says, Jaffa, Gaza, and Jerusalem are the same.
One people, one.
Right, it's the same struggle.
Yeah, one case, one people and one case.
Because these people in Jaffa who are protesting, these Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel in Jaffa who are protesting, they are very much in the same situation as the people in Sheikh Jarrah. They are living as protected tenants. They are constantly being threatened with possible eviction. And they see this happening and they really do see their own story. And the Israeli government picked on this story in a very remarkable way, because in a way, you could say 70 years, the Israeli government has been working to separate people in Gaza from people in the West Bank, from people in East Jerusalem, from people in Jaffa, to make so that we can talk about the Arab minority in Israel and ignore the fact that actually we're 50-50 Jews and Arabs in this country, because the Palestinians are split into so many different groups. And now it's as if they're working to bring all these people together and say this, what this sign is saying: Gaza, Jerusalem, Jaffa, it's all the same story, it's all the same struggle, we're all equally threatened. And the Hamas from Gaza shot rockets towards Jerusalem to say, as Alex mentioned earlier, we will shoot rockets at you until you stop evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. And Israel said, you're shooting rockets, so we. Oh, this is in Lid. You also mentioned Lid, right? Lid is a similar story to Jaffa, is Palestinians, internally displaced people living as protected tenants faced with evictions. There started protests also there. Some Jewish, we don't know exactly, vigilantes or shot a Palestinian protester, a Palestinian Israeli citizen. But you see here his funeral wrapped in a Palestinian flag, which is again people taking the story together. It's this Palestinian struggle in Lid, as it is in Jaffa, as it is in Jerusalem. And this is already the bombing of Gaza. The Israeli bombing of Gaza, and in the Israeli bombing of Gaza, a huge number of homes, apartment buildings was destroyed, and many thousands of people were in fact displaced and made homeless. So this threat has materialized. The one thing that I was asked is, so now I've given the narrative that I've given is the way I see things, but it's also more or less explaining why Palestinians responded as they do. But I was asked, what does the Israeli public who is not so interested or informed, what do Israelis think about this? So the fact is not much. Israelis don't know much about this, about the details of this. And if you tried to figure it out from the Israeli media, you would be pretty lost. So if you follow the Israeli reports, I'm going to go talk specifically about Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, I've heard several times in the last few weeks, my main exposure to media is if I hear the radio news when I'm driving. And what I've heard people say in many different permutations is people are protesting in Sheikh Jarrah because they don't want Jews to move into their neighborhood. Right? That's a story you get in the Israeli media, which is something Israelis can sort of identify with, because Israelis many times protest because they don't want Palestinians to move into their neighborhood. Right? It happened in Afula, it happened in Nazareth, it happened in many places. So the Israeli media tends to present it that way, that Palestinians are unhappy with Jews moving into their neighborhood. They almost never say Palestinians are being evicted. They certainly never tell the whole story of how it happened and what it is. And if you listen to Israeli media, again, one of the things that it's hardest to understand from the Israeli media is why are people protesting also in Jaffa and in Lid? Also, the Israeli citizens, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship or Israeli Arabs, they work with us in our workplaces. They're our neighbors. They serve us hummus. They fix our cars. Why are they suddenly upset about Jews moving into a neighborhood in Jerusalem, or what? Because, and this is the Israeli narrative, because really, I think it's the underlying Israeli narrative, because really, fundamentally, right? Fundamentally, the Israeli narrative is because they believe, sorry, okay. What I showed you, the first slide I showed you, because they believe that all of this is Palestine, because they don't want us here at all. They support Hamas in Gaza because they want to drive the Jews out of the whole country and make this all an Arab Palestine. And so they are a fifth column. They are an internal enemy, which is looking, and as long as we keep our foot down on them and the lid tight, then they serve us hummus and fix our cars. But the moment we allow them to have national aspirations or to give a voice, and they get terribly violent and dangerous. That more or less is the mainstream Israeli narrative, as I understand.
Thank you very much, Yahav. You have an amazing knack for condensing a lot of information in a very clear way. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody. And now I'd love to give the floor to Mohammad Barakat to talk a bit about his experiences in Sheik Jarrah and, of course, Al-Aqsa Mosque. Thank you, Mohammad.
Thank you. Thank you, Yahav. It was a remarkable presentation. You just put it all mostly together. But let's continue about what is happening. First, you have to understand that Israel never gave us the chance as Palestinians to have a unity in every kinds of all aspects of life. So they divided us in several categories. So as what Yahav has mentioned, the first category for the Arabs, they are the Arab citizens of the Israeli state, which they are almost 20% of the population of Israel. The second category are the Palestinians of Jerusalem, the same as myself, my family. We were given the Israeli ID card, the identity card of Israel, but we are not citizens of the Israeli state. And that just shows that we have the right to live in Jerusalem, to work in Israel, to have healthcare and so on, but we have no rights to vote in the Israeli general elections. They gave us the right to vote on what they call it the Municipality of Jerusalem elections, which we boycotted because we believe up till today that East Jerusalem is part of the occupied territories according to the international law. And we are almost 330,000 Palestinians of Jerusalem ID card holder. The third category are the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank and in Gaza. They were given different color ID cards since the occupation of '67. And those people, by the way, in the past, it used to be orange color ID card, and even their license plates cars, they were different color than the Israeli, which is the yellow, and they used to have different color as a way to show that those are from the West Bank and Gaza. But in fact, those people, they used to work in Israel, to stay in Israel, and to travel through Israel without permissions. Things have changed after what we call the Oslo Accords, and that makes it much harder to those Palestinians, which now they are completely have no rights to be in Jerusalem or in Israel unless if they get permissions. So we're talking about 2 million in Gaza and 3 million in the West Bank. But I will concentrate about Jerusalem in a way, and mostly for the main part of Jerusalem, which is the one of the main holy sites for the Muslims, which is connected to the verses to the Muslim holy religion, because it's mentioned in the holy book, in the Quran, about Jerusalem. So what we are seeing is the holy plaza of the mosque, of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the one in the south of the screen, and the Dome of the Rock, which is the place that we believe that our Prophet Muhammad rise up the Mi'raj to the sky and back to Mecca. But what it means for us to be sure that this is a holy site which is connected with Mecca. It is one of the first places where people started to turn their faces towards when they are praying towards God, which is Jerusalem. It is the first Qibla for the Muslims. And this is the third important mosque for the Muslims faith. In fact, the size of the Al-Aqsa, Al-Haram Sharif, it's almost 36 acres of land, which on the west side, the southwest corner, that's where the Barakat, and that's the plaza of the, we call it the the Willing Wall, which is a very holy place for the Jews. And that's where the internationals cross through that corridor to come to visit the Holy Mosque. In fact, before the year 2000, the Holy Mosque was completely open. Even the mosques, you could go in, you buy the ticket, and you could tour inside the mosques. Things have changed since the year 2000, when Mr. Sharon decided to enter, to provocate the holy sites, and that's caused the spark for the second Intifada in the year 2000, September 28, 2000. And from that time, the Palestinians Muslims High Committee, which is the responsible of the holy sites in Jerusalem, decided not to give a chance to any foreigner or any other other than the Islam to come to pray inside the mosque or to visit the mosque. So since that time, we are working according to this system. Now, Ramadan month, which is important for the Muslims, it is one main night of Ramadan. It's mentioned in the Quran, which is Laylatul Qadr, that it is important for everybody to come and see, and even the Palestinians or Arabs, Muslims in anywhere, to come to visit the Holy Mosque. Imagine in this square or this plaza, sometimes during Ramadan Fridays, this place could hold over 350 to 400,000 people. And it happened several times through the years. Israel used to give chances for the Palestinians of the West Bank, Muslims, to come to pray. Arabs, Muslims from citizens of Israel, they used to come to pray. And once when we had the first peace progress after 1994, even Muslims from Jordan, they used to come also in Ramadan time to pray on Fridays in the mosque. But what happened this year? Israel, in a way, as a way to take over Jerusalem after 1967 and after the second Intifada, decided to close Jerusalem by the wall. And that is a main part of the Israeli policy to stop the movements of the Palestinians to come to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the main center city for the Palestinians in all over Palestine. Usually the markets in the old city used to be full of people, movement of people. But to close Jerusalem, it stopped the movement of the Palestinians to come to Jerusalem, and that's just gave only the Palestinians of Jerusalem to defend the holy site in Jerusalem. So this year, what is happening in Sheik Jarrah? What is going on in the area? And since that 27 years of negotiations, the Palestinians have achieved nothing, zero. And we have seen the last years with the Trump administration gave the right to the Israelis to move their capital to Israel, to Jerusalem. That reflected badly on the mentality of the Palestinians and in the we call it the future seeing of the Palestinians to have their freedom. And that caused a lot of trouble, where even though the government gave the right to the settlers around the country to take more land by force from the Palestinians without any kinds of respecting the international resolutions or international law. All that anger came up this year with the Palestinian people of Jerusalem, when they saw that it was impossible for us to get into the mosque area. The Israeli army have new kinds of closures around the old city of Jerusalem, not giving the chance for the youth to celebrate the kinds of after the breaking the fast in the Plaza of Damascus Gate. All that caused the demonstrations to show that the frustration of the Palestinians is getting too much. And since that time, we could see that instead of calming the situation, the Israeli army, police, and the border police, they were trying to do their best by punishing all those Palestinian youth to show that we have the power in Jerusalem. We don't want to see any kinds of roots for the Arabs in Jerusalem to show that it's still an Arab side. And that shows us that Israel, in their policy, they want to have it as a Jewish city. Nothing to show that there's a kind of Palestinians living in here, such as there are people and they have their determination to have their freedom. It just shows you this is an Israeli complete city, and that everything should be going according to the Jewish and Israeli laws. Imagine that inside the wall where Israel have built around Jerusalem, Israel have moved more of those Jewish settlers in the new neighborhoods which had been built and settlements. Nowadays, they have over 220,000 Israeli citizens living in east side of Jerusalem, where the population of Jerusalem, as I told you, 340, we have less than 200,000 Palestinians living inside the wall of Jerusalem, because some of those neighborhoods of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, had been cut out of the wall. So this is what it is happening. Now imagine in Ramadan time, people are coming from the Arab cities in Israel. The Israeli police have closed the main road in Israel, road number 1, stopping the buses which bring prayers from all over Israel to come to pray in Jerusalem. And that makes it much harder for the Palestinians to accept it. And that caused a lot of what we are seeing now. So all that happened, that Israel and the international didn't interfere in a way just to calm the situation and to find solutions. And that's where the first time in the time of occupation, the Arabs of Israel, the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza came together. And now today, we have a big general strike in all over the country. In the West Bank, in Jerusalem, inside Israel, the Arab cities and towns, and even in Gaza, according to what is happening. So this is part of the current situation in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammad. Definitely think we can see with your help the importance of Al-Aqsa to the Palestinians, and that's a very powerful message you shared. So thank you. So now, my friends, I'd love to open things up to questions. I'm sure that there are lots of questions out there. Please use the chat feature to type your questions to me, and then I can call on people to answer them. As I said, we'll try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. The first question I'd love to have asked comes from Anders. I don't know if you're available to ask your question, Anders, but if you'd like to, you can unmute yourself now and ask your question aloud. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you for letting me join this event for the first time. We've heard a lot about a few cities in international media. I'm in Sweden at the moment, and it's like Lod and Jerusalem, of course, and Jaffa, about the unrest, what we could call inside Israel proper, between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish citizens of Israel. But I wonder about the other so-called mixed cities, Nazareth, Accra, Ramla, Haifa. I'm not sure to which extent Beersheba is mixed. What has happened there? Because it's quite new that these cities are so hit as well. I mean, between populations that's usually, I mean, to some extent are living getting along or living together separately, or how we want to put it. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to say we had at least one man killed in Aqsa in intercommunal violence. My friend in Haifa we haven't heard a lot about in the news. Haifa is the most successful example of co-living in this country. But still, my Palestinian friend in Wadi Nisnas in Haifa was telling me that there were groups of far-right Jews coming to attack Wadi Nisnas and Palestinian neighborhoods. Just the police in Haifa did a better job of blocking them, so it ended without much results. So everywhere in the country, we've had this intercommunal violence, and the sense that Palestinians are like the sense. It's interesting. If you listen to Israelis and Palestinians, what you get from Israelis is the police is not there. So there is violence happening and the police is doing nothing. And what you get from Palestinian citizens of Israel is there's gangs of Jews committing violence and the police is aiding and abetting them. But whatever the case, there's a lot of there was a lot of street violence. It's calmed down now, but there was all over.
Thanks, Yahav. Hope that answered your question, Anders. Next of all, I'd love to ask Liz and Tim, Liz or Tim, I suppose. If you'd like to ask your question aloud, you can unmute yourselves now.
Hello, I just wondered whether either of your speakers have any comment on where this current situation leaves Fatah in the West Bank and the government there. Have they made comments? It seems to me they're in quite an awkward situation. I wondered if you had any comment to make on where Fatah stands.
Okay. Well, Fatah is the largest Palestinian liberation organization, which is the main power in the Palestinian Authority. During the years of Fatah, even when Yasser Arafat came to the country, we were promised by the leadership of Fatah and the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that this is the opportunity for the Palestinians to have their own free country, according to what have reached between the internationals, Israel, and the Palestinian leadership. So we were very optimistic that it will lead us to have our own state on our occupied territories of 67. Sorry to tell you, things have changed completely after what we call it, that the right wing in Israel have decided to kill this opportunity by killing Mr. Rabin. And that's where Mr. Netanyahu had been elected and things went completely different as what we were promised to. Imagine in the year 1994, when we started the peace process, that inside the occupied territories in the West Bank, there were only less than 150,000 Israeli settlers. Nowadays, we have over 500,000. And instead of having one state, we have now two states. We have one in Gaza and we have one in the West Bank. Now, in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is the head of the government, and which is the Fatah movement is the largest officials of it. Even we don't have this kind of protection from the Palestinian Authority as Palestinians living under their control. Because Israel have divided the West Bank in 9 governorates completely and closing these 9 governorates that you cannot step from one or drive from one governorate to the other unless if you go through Area C, which is under the Israeli full military control, and that's where the checkpoints, and usually sometimes these checkpoints will be blocked, closed according to the situation, and so you are completely isolated isolated governors from each other, and you will be completely in a big prison. Even though the Palestinian Authority, it has a security forces, and those people, instead of defending the Palestinians where they are, Israeli army in any moment could go into these towns or cities under the Palestinian Authority control, and they could shoot or arrest without any kinds of defending by the Palestinian forces. So this is part what is happening in the West Bank, where security is not given neither from the Palestinian side or from the Israeli side to the people under the Palestinian Authority area or in Area C under the Israeli army forces. But Israel have given the right to those people who are living in these areas under the Palestinian Authority permissions to work in Israel, which is life, in a way, it's much better than the life in Gaza. We have work, we have money, we have sometimes free movement, but at least we don't have security. Never having a complete full security for the people in Area A, which is under the Palestinian Authority or under Fatah movement. In Gaza, when Israel have moved out of Gaza and closing Gaza as one big open jail in all over the world, security is completely given to the people over there, but they don't have work. So you could feel that this is the way that Israel have divided the Palestinians, that in Gaza, you don't have work, you don't have income, but you have security. In the West Bank, there is work, there is money, there is movement, but you don't have security. And this is a way that Mr. Netanyahu wants to keep it, that you will never feel that you are free, or you will never feel that you are a human being. Now, Fatah movement had been in power since 1994, even through the elections of 1996. And in the year 2006, when we have the elections, Fatah movement have lost the elections, and Hamas took over, but the internationals, and mainly Israel and the Americans, say that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we will never give it the chance to be in power. And that just shows that Hamas took the power in Gaza, and Palestinians authority led by Fatah was in power in the West Bank. But Fatah movement, again, since 1994, they didn't give what the Palestinians are expecting of it. Corruption between the officials, main minister, whatever, and that shows that the Palestinians got fed of the situation. So we were looking forward that this year to have elections as a way to bring a new leadership to the Palestinians authority or to the Palestinian people. And we were demanding that the elections should cover all over the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, where Israel never gave us the chance to do these campaigns and do elections in Jerusalem. And that's came up that the Palestinian Authority have postponed the elections, and this is what is happening. So Palestinians could see that both sides are helping to build up a Palestinian, a way that the Palestinians were looking for a Palestinian state that should be deserved for the Palestinians after a long period of struggle, after 73 years of struggle, that we need to have a very powerful leadership. It's not between Hamas or Fatah, it's the people, the Palestinian people will to have a very powerful and good leadership. So this is
maybe
what
can I actually add a question someone's sent in to what you're saying? Is there any, in your knowledge, kind of resistance in Gaza itself to Hamas? Or likewise, I guess, in the West Bank?
In fact, according to my own perspective, before this war, if there was elections, I believe, this is my own perspective again, that Hamas will lose in Gaza because people were looking to have better chances of life. And Hamas will win in the West Bank because Palestinians in the West Bank need somebody to defend them. We need security. So this is what is happening. So the elections have been postponed. There's no elections, and this is what everybody is looking to have a perfect life. So both sides are losing part of their, individual needs.
That's a fascinating analysis. Thank you. Okay, so I'd love to ask next Mina, if you'd like to ask your question aloud, Mina. We'd love to hear from you. How are you doing, Mina?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so going back to what Yahav said, with access to internet and online media, how Israeli media can still influence Israeli people's minds and saying just one part of the story, which is not actually 100% the truth?
That's a beautiful question, but it's also, I think, the answer is quite sad in my understanding, which is to say, what we're seeing all over the world is that actually people are in media bubbles, right? So we know it very clearly about the US. How can people believe that Trump is horrible or Trump is wonderful? Or immigrants are coming to kill you, or whatever it is. The fact that we have all these channels of information, we choose the ones that fit our mindsets. And so it is possible more than ever before to have, for example, Jewish and Arab, or Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel living in two very different narratives of what's happening around us. And it's actually the fact of so much media that makes that possible. If I don't know, even 20 years ago, people were mostly had the same basic news. Now people live in completely different stories of what's happening more than ever.
Yeah, so actually it's just up to people to choose which media listen to.
Well, you might say that, but also we can say, like, many things are up to people, but mostly, the way humanity works, most people do what's happening around them, fit into the pattern of their societies. So of course there are individual people in Gaza who are criticizing Hamas, and people in Israel who are criticizing the Israeli government, but the mainstream and the great majority of the populations are living within the story that is being told around them, and they're not actively choosing to look for another story, because that's something pretty rare for people to do.
Yeah, completely true. Yes, thank you so much. Great.
Thanks, Mina.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Nagolan, but Nagolan has asked me to read the question aloud. So maybe Mohammad, if you want to answer this first, and then Yahav, he or she asks, in the past, Hamas has not responded to incidents in Jerusalem, but they did this time. And what are the implications of this change? So Mohammad, if you'd like to maybe take that first.
Yep. Hamas is a religious group mostly. It's a Muslim Brotherhood, which is very connected to the Muslim faith. And suddenly when it comes to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's the spark which caused them this anger. Sheik Jarrah has also had been in the news long ago, but Sheik Jarrah also is another button for the Palestinians, to press on it, and that's where the anger of the Palestinians will come out, because of the replacements of Israeli Jews and settlers instead of the Palestinians. But when you come to the holy sites, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's where everybody, everywhere in Palestine will come up for it. It happened, if you remember, several years backward, when Israel decided to put the, kinds of,
like metal detectors. Is this what you mean? The security,
Yeah, and that's where the Palestinians of Jerusalem have raised up against it, and they succeeded. And never Israel will accept to lose. So when it comes again to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's where Hamas is responsible as a religious group to defend it. And this is the reason. So the message was from Hamas to the Israeli government is step out of Al-Aqsa Mosque, give the right to the Muslims to come to do their prayers, and also stop the evictions of the Palestinians in Sheik Jarrah. But the main was for the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And they know that everybody will support them in this. This is the reason that the Hamas started to shoot because of the situation.
Yahav, if I can expand the question as I pass it to you, do you have any sense of maybe what's different about this time? Maybe you can include, maybe there's been evictions previously in other parts of Jerusalem. Why do you think the stakes are maybe higher now?
Look, I think it may be useful at this point to say something about the Israeli government and the Israeli politics at this time, because I think there's a big chunk of this which has been left out, which is Netanyahu has failed. We've had 4 elections in 2 years, as you said, has failed to form a government. And all this erupted at the moment when they were very, very near to succeeding to forming a coalition to replace him. The issue about forming a coalition to replace him is that it's made up of people ranging from the extreme right to the left. There's nothing that brings them together except they want to replace Netanyahu. And they were almost agreed just a few hours before the first rockets were shot from Gaza. They said, we pretty much have it down. In a day or two, we'll announce a coalition. And that coalition was supposed to include also the Islamic Party, which represents Palestinian citizens of Israel, which in some larger way is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood and to Hamas also. But they said, like other parties, we're joining this coalition because for right now, this government is going to freeze status quo and other things, and we're going to focus on things that we can agree on. And we're going to not do anything right now about Aqsa or about Sheik Jarrah or about Gaza. We're going to freeze those things we don't agree on and form this government because we need to replace Netanyahu. And what was done, and it seems to me very much like it was intentionally done by Netanyahu and the people under him to escalate the situation, and it was done also in Sheik Jarrah and also in Aqsa, to show them really that you cannot leave these issues for some vague future time, to make it impossible for the Islamic Party to sit in a coalition with settlers, which was what was planned. And I think it's very interesting to see because there is a shift inside Israeli politics. We're seeing it already for a few years. The Palestinian citizens of Israel have been moving up in the world. They're still the poorest group in this country. They're still discriminated against. But we have now more than ever Palestinian Israeli citizens who are doctors in our hospitals, who are authors, who are news commentators, who are influencers. And we got to a point where it seemed like following this last election, for the first time, because the parties representing we have democracy, right? We have democracy inside Israel. Also, the Palestinian citizens vote for parliament. But then after the vote, there's a part of making the coalition. And no Israeli government coalition, or let's say, since 1948 to this day, never was an Arab party in the Israeli government coalition. So the coalitions were always made between the Jewish parties, excluding the Palestinian Arab parties. And it seemed like we were, for the first time in the history of this country, going to see a coalition that included an Arab party. and that would have been a shift also in our representational politics, also probably in the way budgets were shifted, because the Islamic Party said, we're joining because we need you to build schools, to build roads, to stop evictions in Bedouin communities and other things. And it looked like that was going to happen. And that has been undermined now by this push in Aqsa and Sheik Jarrah, which has effectively forced the Palestinian citizens of Israel to stand together with the people of Gaza, to stand together with the people of East Jerusalem against this common threat. It's very, very, very hard at this point, I think, to make any good predictions about the future. It seems also to me that it also has to do with the upcoming Palestinian elections, and that not only was Hamas using this opportunity to shoot rockets to like an election campaign for Hamas, to show Hamas are the defenders of Aqsa, Hamas are the defenders of Sheik Jarrah, but also in what may seem perhaps a strange way, also Netanyahu is campaigning for Hamas in these upcoming elections, because he and in general the Israeli right are happy with an opponent which shoots missiles, rather than one that goes to the UN Security Council, that goes to the International Court in The Hague, that makes legal and political demands in a way that's harder to counter, right? Israel has more missiles. We also have more lawyers, but in that field, the advantage is less definite. So pushing Hamas into further power is useful for the Israeli right. Stopping the possibility of the Islamic Party joining the anti-Netanyahu coalition is useful. So to my mind, what was special this time was really the political will of the Israeli government. They did so many things to push buttons. When they took the most extreme right person in the Israeli parliament, right, who is a Netanyahu supporter, but is on a party that's much further right from Netanyahu, and they brought him to Sheik Jarrah and gave him an office in front of the people having an iftar, and he is a person who's politically calling for the forced removal of Palestinians from all the country. Everything they could, and the police formed security barrier around him to stand there in the middle of Sheik Jarrah. Everything was done to provoke, to push the button, to get this violence rolling, and that I think is the difference this time, that it was a clear joint effort by the various parts of the Israeli government and security forces to drive us into violence.
Thanks for that analysis, yeah, great. One more question maybe about Israeli politics and society before we change track comes from Emily. Would you like to ask your question, Emily? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me?
Yep, perfect.
Hello. Yep, perfect. Perfect. So just a quick question around, I mean, what proportion of Israelis would like to see a state without Palestinians, and what proportion wouldn't? Is that a generalized sort of thought across the board? I'm just interested in kind of understanding that.
Look, most Israelis are right now, the vast majority of Israelis really don't want to hear so much about Palestinians, and they want one version or another of maintaining the status quo, right? Which is what we have now. There are Palestinian citizens inside Israel, but they're not in our coalition. They're not in our government. They're segregated into some areas. They, as I said, in a generalized way, serve us hummus and fix our cars. The great majority of Israelis aren't interested in forcing those people out. They're not a problem. They're a minority that's usefully controlled. So there's people on the far left want to change things and make them significantly more equal and give Palestinians more rights and more opportunities. And there's people on the far right, like Ben Gvir, who put his office in the middle of Sheik Jarrah, who would like to physically, forcefully force Palestinians out of the state of Israel and deny the vote from those remaining. But the majority of Israelis are basically happy with the status quo, with what we have now. If you look at the parties in the Israeli parliament, the great majority of them stand for that on the Palestinian issue. Is basically we keep things more or less where they are now. That's fine for us. And the great majority of Israelis don't even think about this as much of an issue, right? If they're voting on taxes, they're voting on housing, they're voting on healthcare, they're voting on 10 different issues before they're voting on what we do with Palestinians, because Palestinians, most of the time, except when violence like this breaks out, seem to be handled, to be under control, to be not a major issue in Israeli life most of the time. And so I'd say that's what most Israelis think, things are fine.
All right,
go ahead.
Let me
go
add
ahead,
something. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Yahav. To me, as a Palestinian, looking from inside what is happening in Israel, there is a big differences between the governments since the 80s. I remember the elections in 1992 in Israel, where the peace camp was so powerful, and that's when Mr. Rabin have reached the message from the Palestinians that we are a people here and we want to live, and so that's why Mr. Rabin started to have the peace, engagements with the Palestinians, and I remember that they had a very huge rally in Tel Aviv, over 400 to 500,000. Listening to Mr. Rabin in his speech for peace and so on. Well, what happened after he finished his speech? The right wing just shot a bullet, killing the dream of Mr. Rabin and the Israelis' peace camp. And since that time, the peace camp in Israel is shrinking completely. What happened that the right wing in Israel took the power? And I never heard from the parties, the right wing party, mostly in the Israeli parliament, somebody as a leader to say that we want to talk to the Palestinians. We want to have peace with the Palestinians. They are talking about what can we achieve in this land using the Palestinian as hostages in their own towns and their own country, and to use them as labor force. They need the labor force of the Palestinians, and that's why they are keeping us. But even though they don't want us to rise up, they don't want us to ask for our freedom, they don't want us to ask for our rights as a human being. And that's what we are seeing of the acts of the settlers around us in all over the West Bank. They are just stealing the land, beating the farmers, burning the trees, cutting. All that comes without any punishment against them from the government, because those are the ones who are having the power of the coalition in the Israeli government. So sorry to tell you that what, as a Palestinian, seeing what is happening in Israel, it's completely different than what we were expecting since the peace camp in 1994. It's completely different type of mentality in the Israeli society. The peace camp in Israel is shrinking. There are a few thousands of Israelis which they believe the right for both sides, for the both people to live together. We as Palestinians like to have one state solution, to have equal rights, and to stay all together in this land. We will give the right to anyone to come to live in this country, as even the refugees, they have the rights to come back. We have spaces for everybody, of not Palestinians and Israelis in this land. This is what we are looking forward for. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. So we have time for maybe just a couple more questions. We're almost getting towards the end, so I apologize again if your question doesn't get covered. But next up, could we have a question from Philip? An interesting question came through. How are you, Philip?
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Yeah, hello. My question is that there is like kind of information in media that Hamas is actually fed and supported by Iran, and that the situation was also informed by the American President Biden's unfreezing of money for Iran's nuclear program, but Iran pays to Hamas and actually sends them weapons and food and everything. So it's kind of correlated in time with this act from President Biden, with his support of Iran and the massive military, the rocket strike. So what do you think about this situation, and what is the actual role of Iran in supporting the opposition between different parts of Arab society, and the profit from this conflict for the Iran and others who are in coalition with them? Thanks.
Mohammad, you have something to say about this?
Yes. First of all, you have to know that we in the West Bank, I mean in Israel, in Palestine, Palestinians are Sunnis, 100% are Sunnis. We're not Shias. So, but as Palestinians under occupation, anyone who gives us, or who stands and backing us, our rights as people looking for freedom, we appreciate. We are not having any kinds of, political issues with other countries of the world, but as what we have seen, that the Americans, since the beginning of our catastrophe up till today, they are supporting the Israeli government. And it happened the last years when Mr. Trump have moved his embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem without listening to the world and without giving any concern about the international laws that says that East Jerusalem is the occupied territories. Now, because of that, any kinds of help that the Palestinians are having from any country of the world, it's appreciated for us because it is a way to support our struggle to have our freedom. Now, we're talking about the situation between the groups, the armed struggle groups in Palestine, in the Middle East, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, Jihad, others in Iraq, are supported by Iran because they know that those are the organizations or people who are willing to have their freedom from what we call the American policy in the Middle East. And even though we could see that other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, also, they are part of the American lobby in the region. And also we could see that they are standing beside the American policy against our will as Palestinians, and they have the they have the new political agreements and things with Israel without concerning about the rights of the Palestinian. So this comes that people here in Palestine are seeing that the Arab countries are following the American strategy, the American policy, which is the Israeli power. It should be the main power in the Middle East, and even closing up the peace solutions as what we were expecting. It means that the Arabs, which they are like Emirates, Bahrain, others, which they have the new relation with Israel, are coming to say that it is all right for you, to the Israeli government, to take whatever you want and to do whatever you want, and we agree with you. And this is what we are not accepting, and we are not expecting from the Arab countries. Where the Iranian says that Jerusalem should be part of the Palestinian and part of the Muslims and all over the world holy site. So rockets which comes to Hezbollah or to other groups it means that they are the ones who could defend us as Palestinians today to get our rights. So we are looking that even if we have elections in this country, I don't think that we are going to vote to Iran or to vote to others. We will vote for the people, the leadership who will bring us freedom and bring us our rights as a human being.
Thanks, Mohammed. I have to stop you there because we still have one last question I'd love to finish on. So sorry to interrupt you. But the final question I'd love to come from Mona. And if you could both kind of incorporate maybe in your answer, just a question which many people have asked, which is, you know, what can we do? What comes next? What possible actions can we take to help the situation? So Mona, if you'd like to ask your question, and then if you can both can kind of give a sort of summary about what comes next and what future actions can be taken, and that would be great to finish things off.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that. It was incredibly helpful. Just a really short question, which is to understand your views on BDS. It feels like that's where the movement is starting to pivot now. And I'm a journalist. I've really struggled to find resources on like which products seem to be linked to Israeli settlements and just even the efficacy of BDS in terms of, stopping what's happening right now.
And maybe I'll just say BDS, boycott, divestments and sanctions. It's a policy to try and boycott, divest and put sanctions on Israel by internationals. Thanks, Mona.
Yahav, you want to start or you want me to start?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. First of all, you have to know that for us as a Palestinians, according to what we were promised, since the peace camp, we were promised to have our free state. So it comes that the international should recognize Palestine or the Palestinians as a state, which never happened, as what we were promised. The Europeans never say that we want to recognize Palestine up till today. Only one country, which is Sweden, have recognized Palestine. The American state, the United States of America, never done it also. So that makes that much more weak for the Palestinians to ask for their rights in a way. So the only way just to put more pressure on the international community, on the international governments, is to use some of the tools, which is the BDS movement. This will encourage people of the world to put more pressure over their governments, as what happened to South Africa, to stop this apartheid regime that is happening. And that's what Mr. Carter have mentioned in his book, that farther Israel is going with this kinds of regulations, it will come to have an apartheid regime. And it's happening. I mean, the international human rights have already declared. So what we need is to put more pressure over your governments that to recognize Palestine as a state and to use the main tools of putting pressure over Israel as a country to go back for negotiations with the Palestinians, not with the Arabs as what they are doing, only with the Palestinian people to find solutions with them. That's what we need.
Thanks, Mohammed. Yahav, do you want to comment on that and finish things up for us? Thank you.
Okay. So just a detail of what you said, Mona. It is very hard to figure out what goods come from Israeli settlements. And generally what the BDS movement is saying is you don't need to, just don't buy Israeli goods. That's what they're calling for, right? They say don't buy Israeli goods at all, whether they're from settlements or not. It's all one Palestine. It's all one place where there's systemic inequality. And the pressure needs to come in general. I think the general idea we can pretty much all agree on, which is the Israeli state is unchallenged in its use of power. So anyone else, pretty much except, let's say, Britain and the US, if you were to go in and start bombing a densely civilian area, you would come under the Security Council would call on you to stop. There would be, and Israel is a very strong US ally, and we have absolute backing for this, and there's vetoes in the Security Council. And what it means is that Israel has basically a blank check to use violence. And Israel has a very powerful military, and Palestinians don't. So that's going to keep happening. That's going to keep happening as long as that blank check is there. And so what needs to happen is for Israel to be challenged on its use of violence. And we're seeing some movement, right? The most outspoken person in the US right now on this has been Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also Bernie Sanders, also Elizabeth Warren. More and more voices inside the Democratic Party are saying, they're not saying boycott Israel, they're saying our $4 billion a year of military aid to Israel should be conditional on it not being used to massively bomb civilians, let's say. So, I mean, BDS is a nice idea where it comes up from individuals buying or not buying things, but it's a very long and twisted way to go about it, right? The much shorter course would be for people in power to say we are holding Israel responsible for its actions. And that can also be much more directed, right? Not to boycotting Israeli dance troops and academians who say, well, why? But rather to restricting the transfer of weapons, what I think in different countries, it's a different story, right? But certainly I'm just guessing. You're in the UK, but I don't know. In different countries, it's a different story. You can see in the UK also within the Labour Party, there's voices both ways. And Corbyn was a voice for restricting arms to Israel and restricting support of Israeli military actions, and there are such voices, and those voices have the potential to change things here. How those voices can be best supported and strengthened, that's much more a question to you than to me, I think. But I believe that everybody in this country stands to gain from Israel losing its blank check for using blanket violence, and that there are growing voices for that, and that there is potential there to change the situation here.
Thank you so much, Yahav, and thanks, Mona, for a great question to finish things off. So, my friends, I'm afraid we've actually already run out of time, so we're going to have to wrap things up there. As I said, if there are questions which went unanswered, I apologize. Hopefully we managed to kind of cover parts of what you were interested in, if not to directly answering your question. And I will send all the questions to our speakers. We can't promise we'll get to everything, but there's a possibility they may be able to reply to some of your questions by email or something. And I should stress that you can definitely keep this conversation going with us. Please feel free to reach out to us by email. You can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, the lot. This event has been recorded, and along with one that we did last night, it is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next few hours. So you can check back there and watch again or share with your friends and family. And I think to answer the question, what can you do? Obviously, it's very difficult to kind of wave a magic wand, and most of us are not policymakers capable of making these instant impactful decisions. But I think as long as we're all kind of on the side of the scales tipping things towards peace and justice, we can only do so much, and we can definitely make a help in that direction. We as an organization have many other activities like this. A very simple way you can help is to spread the word. We believe that education is very important, and I'm sure many of you are talking about these things and being asked about these issues every day, and spreading the knowledge which you've gained today, I think is a really great step which you can make to help both us and of course the wider issues. If you'd like to learn more and see more from our speakers today, Mohammad leads a twice weekly tour of the Jordan Valley, covering lots of issues that we talked about today, including Palestinian refugees. Yahav leads 2 online sessions a week, one about Jerusalem and one kind of explaining the whole history of the region. I myself lead a twice weekly tour of Gaza online, all of which you can see on our website, and you can register your places there anytime you like. And of course, if you want to give a financial contribution, greenolivetours.com/contributions, anytime, any amount. We thank you very, very much for that, as well as supporting our collective. You're of course also supporting the PCRF, Palestinian Children in Need, will be helped as well. So we thank you very, very much for both your attendance today and any future support you'd like to give us. Thank you both to our speakers, Mohammad and Yahav. Really great job today, and we hope to all see you again in a more happy and peaceful situation. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day wherever in the world you are.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.